Good afternoon. The Holocaust, depending on when you start it, is about 75 or 80 years old this year. But as the award winners in all or most of these categories suggests and attests, it's still with us. I'm going to introduce Max Wallace in a moment, but I want to share with you a little story which may pertain to the book he's written, the wonderful book he's written. A few months ago, I was in Israel, and I was introduced to a man who ostensibly was a kind of money changer, but who actually had a second life working for the state. And I'm a journalist, so I was naturally curious. And I said, "What do you do for the state?" And he said, "Well, I can't really tell you." He said, "But," "you know that the generation of Holocaust survivors is quickly passing." I said, "Yes." "And you know that the generation of Holocaust perpetrators is quickly passing?" I said, "Yes." "We have a list." The conversation that ensued had to do with the kind of work that he did as a kind of reconnaissance person for the state. He said, "I can't really tell you those stories, but I can tell you one story that might interest you." He said, "I was in Brazil, small town in Brazil, walking along the street one day with my partner, and we pass a doorway that has not a mezuzah on the door frame, but the outline of a mezuzah. And he said, I was just struck by that because we're in the middle of nowhere. So I knocked on the door. And a young girl, a teenage girl, came down the stairs, and I said to her, I couldn't help but notice the outline of a mezuzah on your door frame. Can you tell me about it, please?" And she said, "Well, it was my grandmother's." So I said, "Well, where's your grandmother now?" She said, "She's upstairs." "Would you like to meet her?" So he said, "Yes, I would like to meet her very much." So the two of them went up. They were introduced to the grandmother, who, upon seeing these two gentlemen in her doorway, burst into uncontrollable tears, sobbing uncontrollably for several minutes. And when she finally was able to calm down, she said, "You know, for a minute there, I thought you were my long-lost brothers." And the young girl said, "I didn't know you had long-lost brothers." And she then proceeded to narrate her Holocaust story, which had to do with the loss of her two brothers in Auschwitz, her miraculous survival. And at the end of it, the young girl was so moved by all of this that, although she had not been raised with, or had been only raised with a facsimile of Judaism, decided to investigate Judaism more seriously. She began to study Hebrew. She moved from Brazil to Israel. She married an Israeli, and when she was getting married, she decided to invite the man who had knocked on the door because of the missing mezuzah, and he attended. I don't know whether that grandmother actually was in Auschwitz. That's the way the story was told to me. But Auschwitz plays an extraordinary part in Max Wallace's remarkable book that is the award winner today in the category of Holocaust literature. In that book, I want you to consider this cast of very improbable characters. A Finnish masseuse named Felix Kirsten, who, among other clients, treats the architect, one of the leading architects of the Holocaust himself, Heinrich Himmler, the man who created the concentration camps. Then there's an Orthodox Jewish woman named Recha Sternbuch, living in Switzerland, who at significant risk to her own life and the lives of her family, begins and operates and runs successfully a smuggling operation to save other Jewish lives by whatever means necessary. And then there's the former president of Switzerland himself, Jean-Marie Mussy, who, despite his own somewhat anti-Semitic and fascistic leanings, is somehow enlisted in a secret plot with all of these people and several other interesting characters, and somehow persuades Himmler to destroy the concentration camps at Auschwitz and save the desperate and remaining fragment of European Jewry. By any measure, this is an extraordinary tale, even by the standards of the scarcely to believe narratives that have already emerged from the Holocaust. The entire saga is brilliantly and painstakingly reconstructed and told in Max Wallace's remarkable book, In the Name of Humanity, The Secret Deal to End the Holocaust. To the archive of Holocaust history, it makes a critical and valuable contribution. Mr. Wallace is originally from Montreal. He is also the author of books about Muhammad Ali, the musician Kurt Cobain, and the rise of incipient fascism in the United States. A timely book, actually, now that I think about it. It is a very great pleasure this afternoon to present the Canadian Jewish Literary Award for Holocaust Literature to Mr. Max Wallace.
Sorry. Thanks, Michael. I'd also like to thank the jury and the sponsors of the Canadian Jewish Literary Awards. And my partner Morag, my son Dashel are in the audience, along with my two biggest cheerleaders, Sheldon Goldberg and Esther Reiter. And I'd also like to thank my amazing editor, Penguin Random House, Diane Turbide. So before I begin, I hope you allow me to go off on a little brief but relevant tangent, which is inspired by the fact that I just saw that Bob Ray is with us tonight. And the reason that I find this very relevant to the topic of Holocaust history, I'm from Quebec, as Michael pointed out, and a lot of you know that Quebec just elected a government, the CAQ, a couple of weeks ago, that have promised a policy forbidding religious symbols for public servants, teachers, daycare workers. And they claim that this is being done in the name of secularism, but we all know what it's really about. It's about Islamophobia. And when you hear the arguments, and they're horrifying, they talk about how religious Muslims in hijabs are outsiders in Quebec society, they're not real Canadians, they're not real Quebecers, they refuse to integrate. And as a Holocaust historian, these arguments sound very familiar. I would never compare any modern phenomenon to the Holocaust. I think that trivializes the Holocaust. But when you look at the history of Quebec, the rest of Canada too was not immune, but in Quebec in the 30s, before the Holocaust, there was a virulent anti-Semitic movement comprised mainly of intellectuals, including a young Pierre Trudeau, talking about how religious Jews, primarily religious Jews, the visible Jews with the beards, were outsiders, were not real Canadians. And when you hear the same arguments being used today against Muslims, it's quite frightening. And the reason I think this is relevant is that when you dehumanize, the lesson that we have to learn from this, when you dehumanize people, it's very easy to ignore their subsequent genocide, as we learned What happened, Mackenzie King wanted to let in numbers of Jews. He confided to his diary that he was afraid of riots in Quebec if he did. And the rest is history. And so when we talk about the Holocaust, of course, we always talk about never again. We say never again at the Seder. And Bob Ray's presence reminds me that he was one of the first public figures to sound the alarms about the genocide of the Rohingya in Burma. And again, if we allow Islamophobia to fester the way anti-Semitism was allowed to fester 75 years ago, 80 years ago, it's easy to ignore the subsequent genocide. And for months, I despaired of the fact that the world was ignoring this genocide in Burma. And then Bob Ray spoke out, thank you, Mr. Ray. And the Canadian government listened. They've declared it a genocide. They've stripped the Canadian citizenship from the lady, finally. And so I think we're finally starting to learn the lesson. When we talk about never again, we have to be talking about never again for anybody. So back to my book. I actually came across this story almost 20 years ago when I was interviewing Holocaust survivors in Montreal for Steven Spielberg's Shoah project. And you're familiar with the stories, very grim stories, week after week of survivors. And then one day I heard about a survivor with a very different story to tell living in Toronto. I traveled to Toronto, not far from here actually, and met a man named Herman Landau, who was the secretary of a rescue committee in Switzerland during the war. And he opened his archives and told me this story about his cousin, a remarkable woman named Resha Sternbach. And Herman Landau and the Sternbachs, Resha Sternbach and her husband Isaac, were devout ultra-Orthodox Jews. As you can see from the lack of a kippah, I'm a very, very secular Jew. And so I heard the story from Herman. He opened his archives, and imagine my surprise when I found myself immersed for the next 15 years in the world of the ultra-Orthodox. I had grown up, like probably many of you grew up with stories about ultra-Orthodox Jews, stereotypes and myths. And sometimes I thought my own family were anti-Semitic when they talked about the ultra-Orthodox. And so I started on this trail. He led me on this trail. At the time, I had no idea that it would lead me to the gates of Auschwitz. But it starts with this woman, Resha Sternbach, who was just an ordinary Jewish housewife in Switzerland when Hitler came to power. And as country after country started to turn their back, close the doors on the Jews, including Canada being among the worst of all, the Jews started to pour over from Austria and Germany into Switzerland. And Resha Sternbach transformed almost overnight from an ordinary housewife to a heroine of rescue. She established safe houses. She would travel to the border every night, the Austrian border, with a cup of coffee and a motorcycle and a sidecar, rescuing refugees fleeing Hitler. And so she probably saved 3,000 or 4,000 Jews before the war, and then she was arrested in May 1939, a few months before the war began. And that curtailed her activities for a while. She was busy preparing for her trial, and then she hears of a ghetto in Warsaw, where the conditions were getting increasingly worse. The world wasn't talking about this yet. And she reactivated her rescue network and started to send passports, forged passports, to the ghetto, and saved several thousand Jews. Forged passports from Central and South American embassies that she would bribe with middlemen. And And so this went on, and then the story started to come out, and a coded cable was received by the Sternbachs, alerting them that the Warsaw Ghetto was being evacuated, and that the Jews of Europe were being gassed, and that the Nazis intended to eliminate European Jewry. So the Sternbachs weren't the first to sound the alarm, but they were the first to transmit what's known as the Sternbach cable, alerting the West to the final solution. They were also responsible for the myth, one of the unfortunate myths transmitted in the first cable was that the Jews were being not only gassed, but that their ashes were being turned into soap. So this is the origin of the long-held myth that the Nazis made soap out of the Jews. And so they told the Orthodox rabbis in New York to sound the alarm, to alert Roosevelt, to alert Einstein, Thomas Mann. Thomas Mann did a BBC broadcast, one of the first broadcasts alerting the world to what the Nazis were doing in the death camps. And so this went on. Meanwhile, the world was ignoring the slaughter. They didn't believe it. They thought it was the continuation of the atrocity propaganda that was common in the First World War. The Sternbachs despaired as millions of Jews went to their deaths. The Jewish establishment in New York had placed their faith in Roosevelt, who assured them that the best way to stop the Nazis was to win the war as quickly as possible. No talk of rescue. So gradually, as the Nazis began to lose the war, they started talking about ransom. They were willing to free 1 million Jews in exchange for money or in exchange for trucks and tractors. The Allies ruled this out. This was illegal, trading with the enemy. Any ransom was forbidden. The Orthodox answered to a different set of laws. They'd always, the tradition was you bribe, you do anything you need to do to save a life, going back to the Middle Ages. So the Sternbachs arranged a tractor scheme. The Nazis had promised to release the remaining Jews and to blow up the facilities at Auschwitz. In exchange for tractors, they were desperate for tractors. The German population was starving. They couldn't harvest the crops. So the Sternbachs illegally arranged for what's called the Sternbach tractor ransom. 40 tractors were shipped to the Nazis. And at the same time, Resha Sternbach, this extraordinary woman, picture her at her dining room table in Montreux, Switzerland, surrounded by Orthodox Jewish men with beards, listening to her every word. She had formed this rescue committee, and they were at their wits' end. No matter what they did, they saved thousands of Jews, but they saw that millions of the world had turned their back on the Jewish people. And Resha hears about this president of Switzerland, a former president of Switzerland named Jean-Marie Musi, a fascist sympathizer before the war, devout anti-communist, staunch Catholic, who was friends with Himmler, the architect of genocide. And she heard that he had freed these law clients, these Jewish law clients from a concentration camp in France. And that on their way out, Musi goes to rescue this couple. And the SS commander tells him, never before has an Israelite entered a German concentration camp and came out again. So Resha hears about this and summons Musi to her home. And, you know, she was a devout Orthodox Jew, he was a devout Catholic. And she tells him, Herr Musi, we are both servants of God. The Nazis are an affront to everything you believe in. You have to help us. And something about Resha had this charisma, this power. Musi agrees to write to Himmler. And he meets with Himmler in November 1944, beginning of November, and tells him that he's representing the Grand Rabbi Sternbach. And that, he's playing, he knows that the Nazis have this idea of the world Jewish conspiracy, and that the Jews have the year of Roosevelt. And he's desperate at this point. Himmler knows that the war is lost, and he has this fantasy that the Allies are going to bond with the Nazis, turn on Stalin, their common enemy. They both hate communism, that somehow the Allies are going to agree to work with the Nazis to defeat Stalin. Musi plays on this and engineers this massive deception. You have Audacious Sternbach and her husband and Musi engineering a deception, telling him that he's working on behalf of the Orthodox rabbis in New York, and that the West is open to this alliance, to this separate peace, but only if he's first willing to free the Jews and end the genocide. And so this is where I come in. I spent 15 years working on this. I had no idea where it was going to lead. The Orthodox had been given short shrift by most historians who sort of dismissed them as only wanting to save the Orthodox. So I discovered, after many, many years, I discovered documents in the archives of Yeshiva University from just before middle of November 1944, linking these negotiations and Musi's visit to Himmler with the Nazis' decision, Himmler's order on November 25th, to end the final solution and blow up the gas chambers and crematory at Auschwitz. So the gas chambers come tumbling down November. That's the end of the systematic extermination of Jews, 6 months before the end of the war. And historians have always dismissed this, said that, well, the Russians were coming. They were trying to hide the evidence of their crimes. Never really made sense because the Russians were still 2 months away, and the Nazis could have easily killed every last Jew. And so I found documents linking these negotiations to the order. And this is probably the first time, the first compelling evidence that the Nazis actually ended the final solution because of Jewish rescue efforts, rather than the sort of common narrative that that they were trying to hide the evidence of their crimes. So that, in a nutshell, is my book, and it was published, and it's been very well received by historians. I was afraid of controversy. I was afraid that I'd be accused of giving fodder to Holocaust deniers. I said, look, Himmler saved Jews. And so the book is published almost a year ago, and I'm out on my book tour. And one of my first book signings was at a very prestigious literary venue, Costco. So I'm sitting there at my book table, in between the winter tires on one side and the giant briskets on the other, and I'm signing books. And all of a sudden, this very feisty elderly lady comes up to me, shopping with her daughter, marches up to my table, points to the cover of my book, points to the girl second to the left. So a lot of you will recognize this photo. It's a very iconic photo. It's a photo taken by the Russians on the day that they liberated Auschwitz in January 1945. And at that point, there were only a few thousand Jews left. Most of the Jews had been death marched out days earlier. It was mostly children, teenagers, and people who were too sick to march. So she points to this photo and says, "That's me." And I say, "Oh, you mean you're a survivor too? I thought it was a metaphor." And she says, "No, that's me. That's me when I was 9 years old on the day that the Russians liberated the camp." And I stare at her, and 17 years I've been working on this book. She lived maybe 2 kilometers from me the entire time I was writing the book. I had no idea that we were in the same city. And it just hit me at that moment that these events that I've been writing about all this time were the reason why she and so many others survived. And so that's my book.